Sometimes the person who shows up to help you get revenge ends up being the only one capable of healing your pain. She thought she had everything: a career she'd built with her own hands, an apartment she'd painted herself on a Sunday afternoon, a man she'd loved for 3 years, and a future she could already see: white dress, borrowed rings, a name she'd been quietly trying on in her head. But love doesn't warn you when it's about to leave. It doesn't knock. It doesn't apologize. It just disappears and leaves the door open so the cold can get in. Victoria Hayes never imagined that the worst day of her life would happen over coffee, or that the man who would change everything was already sitting in a courtroom on the other side of the city, carrying the exact same wound. This is a story about betrayal, about pride, about a deal so absurd it should never have worked, and about how sometimes the greatest love story of your life begins with the most elegant lie you've ever told. Stay with me. Chicago doesn't sleep gracefully. It hums, it rattles, it moves through you like the wind off Lake Michigan in October, sharp and immediate, the kind that makes you catch your breath and keep walking anyway. Victoria Hayes had been walking through it for 32 years. She moved through the city the way she moved through everything: fast, intentional, with her shoulders squared and her eyes already 3 steps ahead. She wore her dark hair pulled back on courthouse days, a habit she'd developed early, after a judge had once told her she looked too young to be taken seriously. She cut her hair shorter after that, started wearing blazers, learned to use silence the way other attorneys used volume. She was an assistant public defender for Cook County, not the most glamorous title in the Chicago legal world. She knew that. The partners at the firms in the Loop with their leather chairs and their lake views knew that too. She'd had offers, 3 of them, since passing the bar, each one promising money, prestige, a corner office with a view of the city she loved. She'd turned them all down, because there was something about standing in front of a jury with someone on your left who had nothing, no money, no connections, no safety net, and knowing that you were the only thing between them and a system that moved like a machine. That felt like something worth doing. Ethan never quite understood that. He'd said it once, early in their relationship, over pasta and wine at her small apartment in Lincoln Park. "You could be making 3 times the salary, Vic. You're smart enough. You're good enough. Why do you keep choosing the hard thing?" She'd smiled, kissed him, said, "Because someone has to." He'd laughed. She hadn't known then that he was already calculating. Ethan Cole was everything that looked like a future. Tall and polished, with the kind of easy confidence that came from never having been told no by a room he wanted to impress. He was a junior partner at Hargrove and Spence, one of the oldest corporate law firms in Chicago. He wore custom suits on Tuesdays. He sent flowers when he'd done something wrong, which, she told herself, was endearing, even when it happened a little too often. They had met at a bar association mixer 3 years ago. She'd been in the corner, nursing a glass of red wine and debating whether the night had been long enough to justify leaving. He had walked over without invitation, handed her a business card and said, "You looked like the most interesting person in the room. I decided I should probably introduce myself before someone smarter than me got there first." It was a good line. She'd kept the card. 3 years later, they were engaged. The ring was elegant, a square-cut diamond, chosen with more precision than sentiment, but beautiful. She wore it every day. She had already booked a venue. She had been so certain. It was a Tuesday in late September when Ethan sent her a message asking her to meet him at Brasserie Lyon, a French bistro in River North, that they'd been to a dozen times. She didn't think anything of it. She changed out of her courthouse clothes, put on a deep green dress she knew he liked, and took the L downtown. The restaurant was beautiful in the way Chicago restaurants always try to be. Warm light, the smell of butter and wine, waiters who moved like they'd choreographed it. She spotted Ethan at a corner table, already seated, already holding a glass of water he was turning slowly in his hand. She knew something was wrong before she sat down. The flowers weren't there. And Ethan always brought flowers when he'd done something wrong. This time, he hadn't brought flowers. She sat down. He looked at her, and in the silence before he spoke, she understood. The way you sometimes understand the end of something before the words arrive, that the ring she was wearing was about to become a question. "I need to talk to you about something," Ethan said. His voice was steady, measured, lawyer's voice, the one he used in depositions. Victoria set her hands flat on the table. "Okay, I've been doing a lot of thinking. He paused. About us. About where things are going. About what I want my life to look like. She said nothing. I met someone, he said. The sentence landed like something dropped from a height. Not a crash, more of a thud. Dense and final. Her name is Scarlett Whitmore. Whitmore. She knew the name. Everyone in Chicago legal circles knew the name. The Whitmore family had been threading themselves through the fabric of this city for 3 generations. Finance, politics, philanthropy, real estate. Their name was on 2 hospital wings and a building at Northwestern. Scarlett was the youngest daughter, 30 years old, photographed at charity events in gowns that cost more than Victoria's monthly rent. Ethan seemed to choose his next words with surgical care. She's giving me access to things, Victoria. Connections I've been trying to build for years. Introductions, partnerships. Her family's network could take my career somewhere that would take me another decade to reach on my own. Victoria looked at him. You're leaving me for a business opportunity. That's not... It is, Ethan. Her voice was quiet, precisely quiet. The kind of quiet that takes effort. You just told me exactly what I am to you. And what she is. He leaned forward. You're important to me. You'll always be... Don't. The word was simple, not loud, just closed. Don't tell me what I am to you. Not right now. She reached down, and before she could stop herself, before she had a plan or a script or a graceful exit, she took the ring off. She placed it on the table between them, gently, like she was setting down something fragile she no longer wanted to be responsible for. She stood up. She picked up her coat, and she walked out of Brasserie Lyon with her chin up, her shoulders straight, and her eyes entirely dry. She made it exactly 1 block. Then she turned into a narrow alley between a restaurant and a parking garage, put her back against the brick wall, and let herself fall apart for exactly 4 minutes, shaking, silent, because Victoria Hayes had never in her life cried where anyone could see her. 4 minutes. Then she wiped her face, straightened her coat, and walked to the L station. She had a brief to finish by morning. The Daily Center courthouse was a cathedral of a different kind. Brutalist stone and glass, rising over Dearborn Street in the heart of the Loop. Federal Judge Alexander Grant had walked through its doors more mornings than he could count. He knew every creak of the elevator, every echo of footsteps in the marble corridors, every angle of light that came through the courtroom windows at 2 in the afternoon. He was 40 years old, appointed to the federal bench at 37, the youngest in the Northern District of Illinois in over a decade. His record was spotless. His reputation was formidable. His rulings were precise, sometimes controversial, always meticulously reasoned. He was, in the language of the legal world, a man of consequence. In the language of everything else, he was alone. His apartment was on the 42nd floor of a building in Streeterville, with floor-to-ceiling windows, and a view that would have made most people stop and stare every single morning. Alexander rarely stopped. He moved through the apartment in the mornings with efficiency, coffee, news, briefcase, and returned in the evenings with the same efficiency in reverse. The apartment had been designed by an interior architect Scarlett had recommended. Everything was precise. Clean lines, neutral palette, expensive furniture placed at considered angles. It looked, he had once thought, like a showroom, beautiful in exactly the way that had nothing to do with living. Scarlett Whitmore had entered his life 18 months ago at a benefit dinner for the Chicago Bar Foundation. She had sat down beside him uninvited, looked at the award on the table in front of him and said, "I've read 3 of your opinions. You're the most ethically consistent jurist I've encountered in this city. I find it interesting." He had found her interesting too, for a while. She was brilliant in a sharp, horizontal way. She understood power, mapped it, moved through it like water finding its level. She was beautiful. She was relentless. And for 10 months, he had told himself that what they had was worth the small, persistent unease he felt. The sense that when Scarlett looked at him, she was calculating something he couldn't quite see. She had ended it on a Wednesday, in his own kitchen, over the coffee he had made for both of them. "I love you," she said, in a tone that didn't match the words. "But you're not going to change. And I need someone who understands that ethics are a framework, Alexander, not a ceiling." He had set down his mug. "Someone like who?" he asked. She looked at him without flinching. "I met someone, a few months ago. He's an attorney. He understands ambition in a way you and I were never quite aligned on. He had not asked the man's name. He hadn't needed to. What mattered was simpler and more devastating. She had already decided, possibly weeks ago, and she had been there in his kitchen, drinking his coffee, until the moment was right. He'd shown her out with the same quiet composure he showed a courtroom when a verdict came back wrong. That evening, he had sat in his sleek, perfectly designed apartment and listened to the city 37 floors below, all that noise and life and movement, and felt something he hadn't experienced since his father's death, the particular silence of a house that used to have a future in it. 3 weeks after Scarlett left, his clerk, a second-year law student named Daniel who made better coffee than anyone in the building, had knocked on the office door and said, with the careful diplomacy of someone trying to be helpful without being presumptuous, "Judge Grant, some of the other clerks are going to the Anchor after hours on Friday. You are, of course, under no obligation. I'll think about it," Alexander had said. He had not gone to the Anchor. He had gone home, poured a glass of scotch he didn't finish, stood at the window and watched the lights of the city spread out like a circuit board, glittering and indifferent, and wondered how a man could be surrounded by the entire legal apparatus of one of the most complex cities in America and still feel like the quietest person in the room. Madison Reed arrived at Victoria's apartment on Saturday morning with 2 coffees, a paper bag of croissants from the French bakery on Armitage, and the specific energy of someone who has decided that her best friend has been sad long enough. "Get dressed," Madison said, handing her a coffee before she'd even fully opened the door. "It's 10 in the morning. It is. And you have been in this apartment for 6 days, which means you've been eating cereal for dinner and re-watching the same 3 episodes of whatever show makes you feel better, and I love you too much to let day 7 happen." Victoria looked at her. Madison Reed was the kind of person who filled rooms without trying. Warm, loud in all the right ways. A graphic designer with a laugh you could identify from 2 floors up. They had been friends since their first week of law school, before Victoria knew she wanted to practice, and Madison knew she wanted to quit. She was the only person on earth who could talk Victoria into things. "I don't want to go out," Victoria said. "I didn't ask." By 9 that evening, they were at a cocktail lounge in the West Loop called the Glass Room. Dim lighting, leather banquettes, a bar that curved along the back wall like a crescent, the kind of place where Chicago's professional class went to look at each other and pretend they weren't. Victoria was on her second drink and actually, unexpectedly, feeling something that approached okay when she turned to flag down the bartender and collided, with enough force to be embarrassing, directly into the chest of a man who had been standing exactly where she had not been looking. The drink, a gin and tonic, mostly ice, went across his shirt. "Oh, God," Victoria said. "I'm so sorry, She looked up. The man was tall, dark suit, now damp, dark hair, silver at the temples, a face that registered the inconvenience with an expression so controlled it almost looked like patience. He held his arms slightly away from his body, looking down at his shirt, with the contained composure of someone who had developed very good emotional regulation over a long time. "It's fine," he said. "It's not fine. Your shirt is... It's a shirt." He looked at her. Something shifted slightly in his expression, not quite a smile, more like the idea of one. "I've had worse evenings." The bartender appeared with a stack of cocktail napkins. The man took them without drama and began patting his shirt. Victoria grabbed several more napkins and helped without asking if she should, because standing there while someone cleaned up her mess felt worse than helping. "I'm Victoria," she said, because it seemed better than silence. "Alexander. I'm usually less of a hazard. I'll reserve judgment," he said. And this time it was, unmistakably, the beginning of a smile. Madison appeared at Victoria's elbow with the speed of someone who had been watching from a strategic position. She looked at Alexander, looked at Victoria, looked at Alexander's shirt, and said absolutely nothing, which meant she was exercising significant restraint. "Can I buy you a drink?" Victoria asked. "As an apology. The least I can do." He seemed to consider this. "Sure." They found a spot at the far end of the bar. Madison made herself scarce with the subtle grace of someone who saw an opportunity and knew when not to stand in its way. The conversation began the way conversations begin, when 2 guarded people are trying not to be guarded, in careful triangles around the actual subject. They talked about Chicago, about the weather turning, about a new restaurant that had opened in the South Loop. He was measured in the way he spoke, not cold, but deliberate, like someone who chose words the way other people chose furniture. She found herself doing the same, which she didn't usually. Somewhere in the second drink, the triangles got smaller. "You look like you've had a week," he said, with an observation she hadn't expected. "Is it that obvious?" "Not to everyone." He held his glass lightly. "I recognize it." She looked at him. "How recently?" 3 weeks. 6 days for me." He nodded slowly. No performance of sympathy, just acknowledgement. She appreciated that more than she expected. "What happened?" she asked, because she'd found, in the last 6 days, that the only thing more exhausting than talking about it was actively not talking about it. She decided I wasn't right for what she wanted to build. He said it plainly. No bitterness, or at least none that showed. She had a particular vision of her life, and I'd stopped fitting into it. "What's her name?" Victoria asked. She didn't know why she asked. Maybe just to have something concrete. A name made it real in a way that she and her didn't. He paused a moment. "Scarlett Whitmore." Victoria's glass stopped halfway to her mouth. The bar noise continued around them. Music, voices, the clink of ice. All of it suddenly very far away. She set the glass down. "What's wrong?" he asked. She turned to look at him. Fully, for the first time since they'd started talking. "The man who ended things with me," she said carefully. "His name is Ethan Cole." She watched his face, watched the recognition move through it like a tide coming in. He was still for a moment. Then, "He's the attorney. She's the heiress." The silence that followed was a different kind of silence. Not empty, more like the moment between lightning and thunder when you understand exactly how close it was. Alexander looked at his glass, then at her. "They're together." "They've been together," she said. "Longer than either of us knew." Another silence. "Well," he said after a moment. He exhaled once. Not quite a laugh. Something just past it. "That's something." Victoria picked up her drink. "That's one word for it." He suggested they walk. It was after midnight, but Chicago in early October still held warmth in the pavement, and the Chicago Riverwalk, lit and quiet, the black water moving slowly below, was nearly empty. Their footsteps were the loudest thing for a while. Victoria had told him about Ethan. Not everything. She didn't owe a stranger everything, but enough. The 3 years, the restaurant, the ring on the table. He had told her about Scarlett, the 10 months, the kitchen, the morning coffee turned exit speech. They were walking past the bridge at Wabash when he stopped. "Can I ask you something strange?" he said. She looked at him. "You can ask." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the river. Somewhere across the water, the lights of the city made everything shimmer. "Right now," he said, "Ethan Cole is likely attending Scarlett Whitmore's benefit gala next weekend. He's wearing a suit her family's money paid for. He's meeting the people she wanted him to meet, and he's been, by all observable evidence, rewarded for everything he did." Victoria said nothing. It was true. "And we're here," he continued, "walking along the river at midnight, nursing the same wound from the same source." "Your point?" she said. He turned to look at her. "My point is that I'm tired of being the story that gets to be invisible. I'm tired of being the one who lost while they moved on without consequence." "So am I," she said quietly. He held her gaze. "Then do something about it with me." She frowned slightly. "What does that mean?" "Marry me," he said. She stared at him. "Not," he held up a hand. "Not actually, or not permanently. A contract. 6 months. We appear together, publicly, consistently. We make it clear to the world, and specifically to 2 people who currently believe they've left us behind, that we didn't just survive. We thrived." He paused. "You'd have to attend some events, tolerate my presence at a few dinners, appear to be in love with a federal judge." She blinked. "That's insane." "Probably. You're a judge. This could—" "My personal life is my own," he said. "As long as it doesn't affect the bench, it's no one's business. And what we would be doing is perfectly legal. 2 consenting adults, a private agreement." He tilted his head slightly. "The only question is whether you think it's worth doing." Victoria looked at the river. She thought about the ring she'd laid on the table. She thought about the green dress she hadn't worn since. She thought about Ethan standing at some gala in the Whitmore family orbit, his whole face saying, "I made the right choice." She thought about how much she hated that she'd spent 6 days feeling small because of a man who didn't deserve to make her feel anything. 6 months, she said. 6 months, he confirmed, after which we both go back to our lives. She looked at him for a long moment. He held her gaze without pressure. All right, she said. Alexander Grant, you have a deal. He extended his hand. She shook it. And somewhere on the Chicago River, under the lit bridges of the city they both loved, something began. With all the dignity of a legal document, and none of the sentiment of what it would become. His chambers were on the 14th floor of the Dirksen Federal Building. Victoria arrived the next morning at 9, carrying 2 coffees she'd bought from a cart on South Dearborn, feeling slightly surreal about the whole thing and deciding that the coffees were a reasonable anchor to reality. His clerk, young, bewildered, trying very hard to appear professional, showed her in. Alexander was already at his desk. He was in his judicial robe's absence, dark slacks, a white shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, which she filed away as the first piece of human information she'd collected about him. He stood when she entered. She handed him a coffee. He accepted it with a look of brief, genuine gratitude. I drafted something last night, he said, and produced a document that was, without question, the most precise personal agreement she had ever read. She read it carefully, because she was a lawyer, and reading things carefully was not optional. The parties agreed to present as a committed romantic partnership in public settings for a period not to exceed 6 months from the date of execution. Appearances to include social events, professional functions, and public settings in the city of Chicago, specifically inclusive of events at which Ethan Cole or Scarlett Whitmore may be in attendance. No expectation of private intimacy shall exist or be implied. All representations made in public are understood by both parties to be performative in nature. Either party may terminate the agreement with 30 days written notice. She looked up from the document. You wrote this last night. I draft quickly. There's a termination clause. It protects both of us. She looked back down. There was something genuinely strange about holding a document that was, in its own way, the most honest piece of paperwork she'd signed in years. Every clause was clear. Every expectation was named. Every exit was labeled. She thought, if only real relationships came with this much clarity. She picked up a pen. She signed. He signed. He held the document up for a moment, looking at it. 2 names at the bottom of something that had no precedent in any law he'd ever studied. Welcome, he said, to the most dangerous lie of our lives. She looked at him. He looked at her. And despite everything, despite the absurdity, the grief still lodged in her chest, the complete improbability of the next 6 months, Victoria Hayes felt, for the first time in days, like herself. The Whitmore Foundation Annual Benefit Gala was held 3 weeks later at the Art Institute of Chicago. Of course it was. Scarlett Whitmore did nothing that couldn't be framed by lion sculptures and marble stairs. Victoria wore midnight blue, a fitted strapless dress she'd owned for 2 years and never had occasion for, because Ethan had always found formal events exhausting, and they'd skipped more of them than they'd attended. She borrowed diamond earrings from Madison, who had spent 45 minutes on the phone coaching her for what Madison called the entrance. You're not going to walk in there, Madison had said. You're going to arrive. That's the same thing. It is absolutely not the same thing, Victoria. Walking is a physical act. Arriving is an event. Alexander arrived at her apartment in Lincoln Park at 7:15, precisely on time, in a black car and a dark charcoal suit that fit him the way good suits fit people who've stopped caring about impressing anyone and started caring about quality. When she opened the door, he looked at her for a moment, the way you look at something you weren't quite expecting, and said only, "You look exceptional." It was not a compliment delivered for the performance. They weren't at the gala yet. She found that she didn't know what to do with it, which was unusual, so she said, "Thank you," and got her coat. The Art Institute was full. Crystal, candlelight, the kind of low ambient music that costs money to feel effortless. Chicago's philanthropic class in its finest, circuit judges, aldermen, executives, old money and new, orbiting each other with practiced ease. Victoria and Alexander walked in together, her hand on his arm, and Victoria thought, this is theatre. She was performing. She knew how to perform. She'd performed composure in front of juries. She'd performed certainty in front of judges. This was just a different kind of stage. Then she saw Ethan. He was standing near the bar with a group of people she didn't recognize, all of them leaning slightly toward him, the way people lean toward men who suddenly matter. He was wearing a suit she didn't recognize either, something significantly more expensive than anything he'd ever worn when they were together. Scarlett was beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm, radiating the particular ease of someone who has never needed to try. And then Scarlett looked up and saw Alexander. Victoria felt the moment land, watched Scarlett's composure absorb the information and recalculate, the way very controlled people do when something surprises them. Scarlett's gaze moved from Alexander to Victoria, traveled down and back up. "Steady," Alexander said quietly near her ear. "I'm fine," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm talking to myself." She almost laughed. Actually, almost. They crossed the room, stopped to speak with a federal circuit judge who clearly knew Alexander well, then with a partner from Latham and Watkins, then with an alderman who was either genuinely glad to see Alexander or very good at pretending. The whole time Victoria played the part, held his arm, smiled at the right moments, made conversation with the kind of polished ease her years in courtrooms had given her. But she was also herself, which helped. She had opinions. She was interested in the people they spoke to. When a woman from the city's bar association started talking about an upcoming funding crisis in the public defender's office, Victoria forgot she was performing entirely and talked for 10 minutes without stopping. When they moved away from that conversation, Alexander looked at her. "You didn't need to act there," he said. "No," she agreed. It showed. She wasn't sure if that was a compliment or an observation. She decided it was both. Then Ethan was in front of them. She saw it happen in slow motion. The way he materialized through the crowd, drawn by some gravitational impulse she recognized as pride. He had always needed to know how he was perceived by the people he'd left behind. "Victoria," he said. His eyes went to Alexander with poorly concealed assessment. "I didn't know you'd be here tonight." "Ethan." Her voice was pleasant, the kind of pleasant that says exactly nothing. "This is Alexander Grant." "Judge Grant," Alexander said, extending a hand. The use of the title was not aggressive. It was simply accurate. Ethan shook it. "Of course. I've followed some of your opinions." "Occupational hazard," Alexander said. He looked at Ethan the way Victoria imagined he looked at difficult witnesses, calmly, without expression, giving nothing. Ethan looked back at Victoria. Something moved behind his eyes. Not quite regret, not quite jealousy. Something caught between them. "You look well," he said. "I am well," she said, and meant it more than he deserved to know. Scarlett arrived then, appearing at Ethan's side with the precision of someone who had crossed a room specifically to be beside him when he needed her. She looked at Alexander with an expression that had layers to it, layers she'd had years to develop and refine. "Alexander," she said. "Scarlett," he said. 4 syllables. Between them, an entire ended chapter. She looked at Victoria, extended a hand. "I don't think we've been properly introduced." "Victoria Hayes," she said, shaking it. Scarlett smiled, beautiful and specific. "I've heard wonderful things." No one present, including Scarlett, believed that was true. It didn't matter. The point was made. The night continued. And somewhere in the gilded rooms of the Art Institute, Ethan Cole spent the rest of the evening watching his ex-fiancée move through a room on the arm of a federal judge, as though she had always belonged there. He left early. Victoria noticed. She told herself she didn't care. She was right. She didn't. What she felt was something better. The first clean breath she'd taken in 6 weeks. It began as theater. It became, gradually then suddenly, something else. They appeared together twice that first week. A dinner at a restaurant in the Gold Coast, where 2 of Alexander's colleagues from the 7th Circuit happened to be seated at a neighboring table. A walk through Millennium Park on a Saturday afternoon that Madison had technically suggested, ostensibly for the photo opportunities, though Victoria suspected Madison just wanted to see them in daylight and report back. The photos were posted. Instagram first, then picked up by a Chicago Society gossip column that Victoria hadn't known existed until Madison sent her a link to an entry that referred to Alexander as Chicago's most eligible jurist, which made him visibly pained. "I didn't know there was a column." "There are many columns," Victoria told him. "I'd prefer if there weren't." "Welcome to the plan you came up with." He looked at her. She kept her expression neutral. He exhaled through his nose, which he was beginning to recognize as his version of amusement. The dinners started becoming comfortable faster than either of them had scheduled. The second week, they had dinner at a French restaurant in the River North neighborhood, not for appearances, technically, though that was the official reason. In practice, they were there because they had both had difficult days, and he had texted her at 5:30. "Dinner? I know a place with exceptional duck confit and minimal ambient music." And she had typed back immediately, "Yes," before she remembered to weigh the implications. Over dinner, she found out that he had grown up in Hyde Park, that his father had been a high school history teacher who read Dostoevsky on weekends, that he had wanted to be a poet at 14, before deciding that law was a better use of his particular need for precision, that he had never, in his adult life, owned a houseplant, because he didn't trust himself to keep things alive. "That's a sad fact about yourself to know," she said. "It's an honest one," he said. She told him she'd grown up in Bridgeport, that her mother had worked 2 jobs through her childhood, which was why Victoria had trouble justifying leaving a courtroom when there was more to do, that she had a weakness for sad detective novels, and also, embarrassingly, for those YouTube videos where people renovate houses in under 60 seconds, that she had once cried at a documentary about bees. "I'm not going to pretend that doesn't change my assessment of you," he said. "Bees are fascinating, and their decline is troubling," she said. "That's not what I meant." She looked at him. He was looking at her over the rim of his glass, not with the expression she'd come to think of as his courtroom face, but something quieter, less fortified. She looked away first. 3 weeks in, she changed one small thing in his apartment. She had been there to drop off a set of event invitations he'd asked her to review, because she had better taste, she had informed him, and he had agreed with no argument, which she found disarming. And while she waited for him to finish a phone call, she looked around the space. It was beautiful in the way a staged property is beautiful. All clean lines and careful neutrality. No books out of shelves, no mugs left on the counter, no evidence of anyone having lived a day in it. Without asking herself whether it was overstepping, she moved a plant. There was, in fact, a single plant, a large bird of paradise in a concrete pot near the window, positioned so it caught the light. But it had been placed as an architectural element, far from anything, alone and decorative. She moved it to a corner near the bookshelf where the light still hit it, but where it was near things, instead of beside empty space. When Alexander came back in, he stopped, looked at the plant, looked at her. "I moved it," she said. "I see that." It was too alone. A pause. "It's a plant." It was still too alone. He looked at it for another moment. Then he looked at her, and said nothing, which was sometimes the way he said the most. He made her coffee instead. It was exactly the right strength. She didn't comment. He didn't explain. 4 weeks in, he laughed for the first time. They were at a gala for the Chicago Symphony. Black tie, the kind of evening where everything takes longer than expected, and the programs are somehow 3 pages too long. They had been standing by the champagne station, quietly watching a conversation about real estate happening 6 feet away that had already been going on for 22 minutes, and Victoria had leaned up and said near his ear, "If he says Naperville is the new Lincoln Park one more time, I'm going to commit a crime." And Alexander had laughed, not politely, actually laughed, a short, surprised sound, like it had gotten out before he could contain it. He caught himself, pressed his mouth together, but it was too late. She had already seen it. She stored it carefully. She wasn't sure why. She only knew it felt like something worth keeping. It was a Friday night, 6 weeks into the agreement. She was at his apartment because there was a dinner the next morning, a brunch, technically, with 2 of his colleagues from the appellate court and their partners, and they had decided it made logistical sense for her to stay. The second bedroom had been hers for 3 weeks, in the sense that she kept a few things there. A change of clothes, a book, a specific tea she preferred in the morning. They had ordered in Thai food, because it was Friday, and he had had a brutal week involving a multi-defendant fraud trial that had lost 2 weeks of testimony to a procedural error. She had had her own brutal week involving a client who had been detained past the statutory hearing window, and she had filed an emergency motion at 10 at night and won it by 8 the next morning. They ate on the couch, which was new. The first month, they had always eaten at the table. At some point, the table had stopped being the point. He had a glass of scotch. She had a glass of wine. The city was lit outside the windows, and the rain was happening gently, the kind of rain Chicago does in October that isn't dramatic but is very thorough. They had been talking about the fraud trial, about the detention case, about a law professor they'd both studied under at different times, about the strange way ambition could be both an engine and a blindfold, when the conversation went quiet. Not the early quiet. Not the managed quiet of two people performing politeness. The other kind. She was aware suddenly that the apartment felt different than it had 6 weeks ago. There was her tea on the counter. There was the bird of paradise in the corner. There was a book of hers on the end table. A detective novel she'd been recommending to him in installments because he'd admitted he'd never read fiction for pleasure as an adult, which she had found both bewildering and fixable. There was, she thought, the quiet shape of something. "You're thinking," he said. "Usually," she said. "What about?" It wasn't really a question, or it was, but not an invasive one. Just open. She looked at him. He was looking at her with that particular attention she'd come to recognize. Fully present, not calculating, just here. "You know what I know about you?" she said. "In 6 weeks. Yes. I knew Ethan for 3 years. I could tell you about his career, his preferences, his schedule, the suits he liked." She paused. "I couldn't tell you what he was afraid of. I couldn't tell you what kind of child he was. I couldn't tell you what he wanted before he wanted what he wanted." Alexander said nothing. "I know what you're afraid of," she said. "I know what you were like at 14. I know exactly where you go when things go wrong." She shook her head slightly. "That doesn't make sense." "It makes sense," he said quietly. "It just feels faster than it should." "It does." He looked at her. "Does that frighten you?" She considered. "A little. Does it frighten you?" He was quiet for a long moment. More than a little. Outside, the rain. Inside, the particular quality of a room where something is about to shift. He set down his glass. She was very still. He reached over slowly and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. Just that. A simple and complete gesture. His hand stayed at her jaw for a moment. She said, "This is going to complicate everything." "Probably," he said. "We had a contract." "We did." "This isn't in the contract." "No," he said. "It isn't." His thumb moved once, lightly along her cheekbone. "Maybe," he said quietly. "I don't want a simple story anymore." She looked at him for one more breath. Then she closed the distance. And the kiss was nothing like a performance. It was soft and certain and unhurried. It lasted exactly long enough to make everything that had come before it feel like weather, something you pass through on your way to where you're going. When it ended, she leaned her forehead against his for a moment. "That wasn't in the contract," she said. "No." His voice was low. "But I think the contract stopped mattering before either of us noticed." Outside, Chicago kept raining. Inside, something that had started as a lie became, quietly and irrevocably, the truth. He asked her on a Thursday the week after. "I have a friend with a house in South Haven," he said, "an hour and a half across the lake. I'd like to go this weekend if you'd come." "The event schedule?" "There's nothing this weekend." He paused. "I checked." She looked at him. "You checked for a gap." "I planned for a gap." She studied him for a moment. His face, usually so composed, held something that wasn't quite asking, but was something adjacent to it. Something that wanted her to say yes, not because the contract required her to, but because she wanted to. "Okay," she said. "Okay?" "Yes, Alexander. Okay." He looked at her. Something in him seemed to settle. South Haven in October was quiet in the best way. The summer crowd had gone. The beach was all stone and pale sand and sky, the lake stretching out to the horizon with the blue-gray authority it had in autumn, enormous and unimpressionable, indifferent to human schedules. The house was smaller than she expected, not the grand thing his apartment implied. A white clapboard cottage, wide porch, a kitchen with old tile and a wood stove that worked. His friend had said he could have it for the weekend, no questions. They arrived in the late afternoon. She made coffee in a kitchen that felt like someone's grandmother had chosen every item carefully and left it for anyone who needed it. He built a fire in the wood stove. The dog from the neighboring property, a large tan retriever who apparently had no sense of property boundaries, arrived through the back gate and installed himself on the porch, as though he'd been invited. "That's Theodore," Alexander said, when he found the dog there, as though they had a history. "You know the neighbor's dog? He's been here before. You've been here before. Once or twice. Alone." He looked at Theodore, then at her. "It's better this time." They walked down to the beach before dinner. The lake was enormous and moving and cold, the wind off the water working through Victoria's coat in a way she found clarifying rather than uncomfortable. They didn't fill the silence with conversation. They just walked, side by side, a few inches between them that kept lessening as the walk went on. She found his hand, or he found hers. It was hard to say which, in the way it's hard to say who started a conversation you can't imagine having been the one not to start. "Can I tell you something I haven't told anyone?" she said. "Yes. I'm not angry at Ethan anymore." She looked out at the water. "I was for a while. Furious, in that clean and total way. But it passed." She paused. "What I feel now is mostly just sad that I spent 3 years not seeing clearly, that I loved something I had made up." He was quiet for a moment. "What do you mean?" "I mean I loved who I imagined he'd become. I was filling in the gaps with someone else, seeing a future that wasn't actually in front of me." She exhaled. "I should have seen it sooner." "Or," he said, "you loved what you had with the information you had, and when new information arrived, you revised." She looked at him. "That's not a character flaw," he said. "That's just being human." She held his hand a little more firmly. He held hers back. "Scarlett showed me something useful," he said after a while. "She showed me I'd been so focused on being reliable, on being the one you could count on, the one who wouldn't shift, that I'd made myself into a room with no windows, safe to be in, but no light. You're not like that." "I was." He looked at the lake. "I'm trying to be different. I'm not entirely sure how." "You're doing fine," she said. He looked at her. The wind moved her hair. He reached over and didn't fix it. Just watched it. The way you watch something you find beautiful without needing to intervene. "Victoria," he said. I need to tell you something." She waited. "I'm not performing anymore." He said it simply, like a fact he'd established and was now reporting. "When I'm with you, none of it is performance, and I wanted to say that out loud so that you knew, so there wasn't any ambiguity between us. What started as an agreement stopped being an agreement, and I think you know that, and I wanted to say it plainly." She looked at him for a long moment. The lake moved. Theodore barked at something 100 yards up the beach and then forgot about it. "I know," she said. "It stopped for me too." He pulled her in, one arm, her shoulder against his chest, facing the water. She let him. She stayed there for a while, listening to the lake. "We started this wanting to prove something to them," she said. "Yes, I don't care about that anymore." "No," he said. "I don't either. I just want to build something with you." He pressed his lips against the top of her head, lightly, like a decision he'd made. "Then let's build something," he said. They came back to Chicago on Sunday evening. He dropped her at her apartment, walked her to the door, and stood with her for a moment under the porch light. "Dinner this week?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "Wednesday." He nodded. She went inside. She stood in her apartment, which was warm and familiar, and hers, and felt the strange peace of someone who had gone somewhere they didn't expect to go and come back changed by it. She called Madison. Madison answered in 3 seconds. "Tell me everything," she said, before Victoria could speak. "He held my hand," Victoria said. "And?" "We walked on the beach." "And?" He said, very plainly and specifically, that nothing is a performance anymore. The silence on Madison's end was the loudest she'd ever heard. "Victoria Hayes," Madison said eventually. "Yes, you are completely done for." "I know," Victoria said. It was 2 weeks later when Scarlett appeared. Victoria was leaving the Cook County Courthouse at 5:15, laptop bag over one shoulder, coffee going cold in her hand when she heard her name from across the steps. She turned. Scarlett Whitmore was at the bottom of the courthouse steps. Not casual. Scarlett was never casual. Camel coat, structured handbag, the particular patience of someone who has decided to have a conversation and has simply arranged their schedule around it. Victoria walked down the steps slowly. "What can I do for you?" she said. Scarlett looked at her with the kind of assessment that was meant to be unsettling. Victoria was immune to it. She dealt with prosecutors. "I want to know if it's real," Scarlett said. Victoria studied her. "That's a strange thing to walk up to a stranger's courthouse and ask." "Maybe. But I think we both know we're not exactly strangers." Scarlett tilted her head. "Alexander is very careful. He doesn't make impulsive choices. So either you two genuinely found something, or you're running a very disciplined campaign, in which case I'm curious who thought of it." "He did," Victoria said, because she had decided, somewhere in the last several weeks, that honesty was the only currency worth using. Scarlett's eyes moved slightly. Something shifted. "It started as a campaign," Victoria said, "and then it didn't. That's the whole story, actually." Scarlett was quiet for a moment. "He deserves someone who sees him," she said finally, not unkindly. "Something that, in another life, might have been genuine. I was never able to. I tried. But he operates on a frequency that requires patience I don't have." "I know," Victoria said. "I find it easy." A pause. "Good," Scarlett said, and turned and walked away. Ethan was harder. He found her at a coffee shop in Lincoln Park on a Tuesday morning, the wormhole on Milwaukee, where she always went when she needed quiet and her office was too loud. She was deep in a brief when he sat down across from her without asking. She looked up, set down her pen. "Ethan." He looked tired. Not dramatically, just in the particular way of someone who has gotten a thing they wanted and found it wasn't the weight they expected. "I've been thinking about you," he said. "I've been thinking about work," she said. "Can this wait?" "No." He leaned forward. "Victoria, I made a mistake." She looked at him. "I was so focused on what Scarlett could give me, what the Whitmore name meant, that I walked away from what I actually had." He met her eyes. "I walked away from you." She held his gaze. "I'm not asking for anything," he said. "I just want to tell you that I know what I did. I know what I lost." She put down the pen. "Ethan," she said, "I believe you. I actually do." She paused. "But you didn't lose me. I wasn't lost. You left me at a restaurant on a Tuesday night and I walked out and kept living." She kept her voice even, not unkind, not angry, precise. "What you lost was an illusion of what you thought I'd always be. Patient, available, waiting." He said nothing. "I'm glad you told me," she said. "I mean that. But this conversation doesn't change anything. Because the thing is, what came after you was better, and I couldn't have gotten there without you leaving." She looked at him. "So maybe the most honest thing I can say is, thank you for going." He blinked. She picked up her pen. "I have a brief," she said. "You should probably get to your office." He stood. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You seem happy." "I am," she said, and meant it completely. He left. She returned to her brief. She texted Alexander at 9:15. "Ethan showed up this morning." He replied in 4 minutes. "Are you all right?" She smiled. "Yes, more than." "Good," he said. "Dinner is still Wednesday." "Yes," she wrote. "Dinner is still Wednesday." It was Madison who called her in the first week of December. "Someone leaked it," she said. Victoria went still. "There's a piece in the Tribune's society blog. Very short, very pointed. It says, and I'm quoting, that the relationship between Judge Alexander Grant and Public Defender Victoria Hayes is understood by those close to both parties to be contractual in nature." She closed her eyes. "It doesn't name Ethan or Scarlett," Madison continued, "but it implies the relationship began at the same time that both parties experienced romantic losses. The word revenge is used." Alexander called her before she could call him. "I've seen it," he said. "I'm sorry." She moved to the window. "If this causes problems for you professionally, it won't," he said. There was something firm in his voice, not defensive, certain. "My conduct on the bench has been and will remain consistent. My personal life is my own." "Alexander, someone told them, someone who knew." "I know." A pause. "The question is what we do now." She stood at the window, watching Lincoln Park go about its Tuesday. "What do you want to do?" A long silence. "Victoria," he said, "I want to be very clear about something." "Okay. Whatever it started as, however it began, is not what it is now. And I'm not going to allow someone else's version of this story to be the one that matters." She exhaled. "But I need to know," he said quietly, "what you want." She thought about the cottage in South Haven, about the beach and the fire, and Theodore, the uninvited retriever. About 6 weeks of dinners and 6 months of becoming. About what it felt like to be known by someone. "I want what's real," she said, "which is you." The silence on his end was brief. "All right," he said. "Then let's fix this properly." She frowned. "How?" "Meet me at the courthouse steps. Tomorrow morning. 8 o'clock. "What are we doing?" "Something honest for once," he said. "For the first time since we started." He was there at 7:55. She arrived at 8 precisely. He was standing on the steps in his dark coat, the morning sharp and cold around him, the city beginning its day behind him. She walked up to him. He reached out and took both her hands. "I want to tell you something in daylight," he said. "Without a contract, and without an audience, and without the performance of any of it." She looked up at him. "I made you a proposal once," he said. "An absurd one, in the middle of the night, on a bridge over a river, driven by pride and grief, and an embarrassing amount of arrogance." His hands tightened slightly over hers. "And you said yes, which I'll never entirely get over, because it was genuinely a ridiculous thing to say yes to." She felt something warm and inconvenient happening behind her eyes. "I want to ask you again," he said. "Not on a bridge, not at midnight, not because of them, not for any of the reasons the contract listed." He looked at her, fully, without his courtroom composure, without the careful neutrality. Just him. Just this. "I want to ask because of everything that happened in the middle, because of who you are and who I'm becoming when I'm near you, because the apartment has a plant that isn't alone anymore, and I want to keep building something with you." He paused. "Victoria Hayes, will you marry me?" Actually, without the performance, just the truth. She looked at him for a long moment. The courthouse was behind them. The city was moving. The sky over Chicago was the particular color of early winter, silver and wide and full of promise. "Yes," she said. He pulled her in, held her, the kind of hold that isn't for anyone watching, just two people, finding each other in the middle of a city that had always been too loud and too much, but had somehow, against all probability, brought them to this specific set of steps. Someone walking past said, "Oh, that's sweet." They both laughed. She stayed in his arms a moment longer. "No contract?" she said. "No contract," he said. "No termination clause." "No termination clause." She smiled against his shoulder. "Good. I always thought the 30-day notice period was excessive anyway." They were married on a Saturday in March, at the rooftop of a building in the West Loop that had once been a factory and now had floor-to-ceiling windows and an unbroken view of the city. It was small, 30 people, the right ones. Madison was there in a burnt orange dress, holding flowers that were too large for the occasion and making no apologies for this. Alexander's clerk, Daniel, was there, looking profoundly moved. Several of Alexander's colleagues came, and several of Victoria's colleagues from the public defender's office, and her mother, who had taken the train from Bridgeport and who, upon meeting Alexander, had looked at him for a long moment and said, "You seem steady," and he had said, "I'm trying," and she had nodded as though this was the correct answer. There were no grand speeches. Victoria had written her own vows, which were precise and brief and true. Alexander had written his, which were longer than expected, and held the kind of honesty he had been learning, slowly and deliberately, to let out into the open. He said, "I came to you carrying the wrong story about myself. I thought I was a man who'd been failed by love, and I was trying to do something proud about it. Instead, I found you, and everything I thought I knew about what I wanted became something larger." She said, "You moved a plant back into the room and called it insignificant. But I think you knew. I think you've known for a long time." He smiled. The real one. The one she'd found first on a riverwalk at midnight. They were married under the Chicago skyline, with Lake Michigan visible on the eastern horizon and the city humming its constant hum beneath them. 3 years later, Millennium Park on a Saturday in June, the fountains on and the grass full of people, the sky the deep blue that Chicago earns every summer, like a reward for getting through winter. Victoria and Alexander were sitting on a blanket near the Crown Fountain. Between them, a 19-month-old boy named Oliver, who was currently standing with great concentration on unsteady legs, reaching for a blade of grass that kept moving in the breeze. "He's going to fall," Alexander said. "He's going to figure it out," Victoria said. "He's going to fall first." "Yes, and then figure it out." Oliver sat down with cheerful abruptness, looked at them both, and then began investigating the grass with his whole hand. Alexander watched him with an expression Victoria had come to think of as his unguarded face, the one that existed only when no one was watching. Except she was watching. She always was. She leaned against his shoulder. "Do you remember," she said, "what you said to me on the riverwalk?" "I said many things on the riverwalk." "Cas conmigo," she smiled. "Marry me." Just like that. 2 a.m, completely absurd. He made a low sound. I was in a difficult emotional state. "You were magnificent," she said. It was the most preposterous thing I'd ever been asked. And I said yes immediately. You hesitated. For approximately 8 seconds. That counts as immediately when the proposal includes a contract. He put his arm around her. She stayed where she was, against his side, watching Oliver discover that grass had texture, and the world had depth, and everything was endlessly interesting when you were 19 months old. She thought about the green dress she'd worn to a restaurant where a man had handed her back 3 years of her life in exchange for a business opportunity. She thought about an alley and 4 minutes of falling apart. She thought about a gin and tonic spilled across a dark suit, a walk along the river in October, a piece of paper with 2 signatures at the bottom. She thought about a plant moved into the light. "I used to think that day destroyed me," she said. Alexander was quiet for a moment. "And now? Now I think it was the best thing that ever happened to me." She looked at him. "Not because of what I lost, because of where the wreckage pointed." He looked at her. The honest face, the unguarded one. "The most honest thing I ever did," he said, "was make a dishonest proposal." She laughed. Oliver looked up at the sound, her laugh, and laughed too, in the instinctive and total way that babies laugh, which is the purest thing in the world. Alexander looked at his son, at his wife, at the fountain and the park and the city that had held all of this, the grief and the mistake and the river walk, and the rooftop, and the morning on a set of courthouse steps. "I have something I want to tell you," he said. She looked up at him. "I love you," he said, plainly, precisely, the way he'd learned to say the things that mattered, without performance, without ceremony, without building a case. "I love you in the specific way that I didn't know was possible before you. And I love Oliver, and I love the plant in the corner that's been thriving for 3 years, and I love this ridiculous city." He paused. "And I love that we started wrong and got to here." She took his hand, held it. "Same," she said, which was, for a woman who could have said more, exactly the right amount. Oliver went back to the grass. The fountain ran. The city moved. And in Millennium Park, on a Saturday in June, a story that had started with betrayal and pride and the most absurd proposal in the history of Chicago ended exactly the way all the best ones do. Not perfectly, but true.